Welcome back. You've got Kjael here. This is the Scaling Ventures podcast. We are building a portfolio of niche vertical SaaS firms that punch like $50 million ARR giants. Yeehaw! I'm riding solo today and very, very jazzed to talk through this topic. This definitely has felt like kind of a punch through, breakthrough, punctuated equilibrium moment, and certainly very excited to share it with you all. The headline here is the system that informs all systems, turning knowledge into operating leverage. And at its base, this is about a system to manage knowledge. And so in terms of a table of contents, and by knowledge, I mean how functions work, how different kind of motions or plays are structured, who's accountable for what, how we score and measure performance of the business on a regular basis, where we centralize meeting notes, action items, how we look and kind of socialize goals and OKRs. Those are kind of the core tenets, and we'll get into it here. But in terms of a table of contents, we'll talk through some principles around the system. We'll talk through architecture. And this obviously all lives in Notion, but kind of similar platform will do the trick. So we'll talk principles, architecture. We'll provide an example, high-level table of contents, leave you with a few real-world examples and applications. And then if you need some templates, they're in our Substack. But we've got a template for a function, like kind of insert function operating model, a template for an insert function playbook, and then one for an SOP. So let's jump in with like a little bit of context. I guess over the years, like you start to appreciate what are like universal truths, or we call it splitting the atom, first principles, whatever the case may be. And the reality is that every firm, right, is unique product, unique market, unique customer base, et cetera. And what's kind of surprising is that like that slick product and thrilled customers is really, it takes a lot more than that to scale, kind of counterintuitively. And so if you think analogously, and for those that haven't read Revenue Architecture by Yako and the Winning by Design crew, that's just really had a huge impact on thought processes and how we think about the world. But there are some things that we can take from a factory setting. Obviously, we're knowledge workers. This is a very different economy. But in terms of like a blueprint and systems and assembly lines, like those types of analogies are actually very useful. And when you start to think about the world in that way, they're universal as well. So it's kind of this system that underpins everything the business does is very transferable in terms of the core mechanics and kind of the tenets. And it's, I guess, the ticket, it's the sauce. So if there's one thing to really master, this would probably be it. And I should say too that, context is very important. So this stuff becomes way more impactful the bigger the business, the broader the team, the more functionally specialized the team, et cetera. So dial this back or dial this up as you see fit. But ideally, coming out of this, you'll have a clear point of view on why this matters and kind of the building blocks to create one yourself. So I guess when we step in, it's almost always the same challenges, right? In a business when you're kind of trying to get into this scale stage. And the first is that there's tons of tribal knowledge, or the thing that you hear a lot is like, oh, we've got a playbook for that. It's like, okay, let's see it. It's like, oh no, it's between Bill's ears. It's like, all right, well, it might as well not exist. Like, how do we train people against that? How do we measure performance against that? It's between your ears. It might as well not exist. So the first kind of issue is tribal knowledge bottlenecks, where critical stuff lives between people's ears. And then as everything's kind of a derivative of that. So namely, that leads to inconsistent execution, right? Basically, execution depends on whoever's got their hands on the steering wheel. And then more importantly is kind of reinventing the wheel. So ideally, we want to preserve as much of our high output, high quality mental capacity, if you will, for stuff that creates impact. So anything that we repeat on a regular basis, we want to try to strip as much thinking out of that process as humanly possible so that we can point that energy, that cognitive load, if you will, at stuff that moves the needle. So the last thing we want to do is kind of step into thinking, okay, I go over here and then I do this, and you come out a little bit fatigued and it's like, hey, we've got this really impactful conversation to have and don't have the gas for it. So those are kind of some of the issues. And when processes are well documented, this was a big learning lesson from me, from a dear friend and peer, where it's like, we need to kind of be documenting what we're doing so that we have a clear kind of thing to look back on, extract learning from, et cetera. And he said, if we do it right, the thing will document itself. And I was like, whoa, boy. All right. That sounds good to me. But the bottom line is processes are documented, quality control is built in, and execution is obviously repeatable. So that's what we're after. We're after kind of a high quality, repeatable nature for everything that we do in the business. And that unlocks the capacity to scale without kind of layering in more and more resources, meaning human people, because then that increases the likelihood of confusion, and that tends to actually have a drag on the whole thing. So we set out to really kind of tune our perspective on what knowledge management looked like, the system for doing that, as really kind of like the fundamental split the atom, if you will, component that it takes to operating an effective and high performant business and scaling it in some kind of predictable nature. So a few examples, like revenue generating motions become assembly lines. And this is back where you see kind of like the factory analogy, but think about ramping salespeople, running any kind of campaign, internal handoffs, and kind of functional dependencies between the business, thinking about feedback loops. We brought on a new customer. There were some expectations set during the sales process. Okay, we need to snap together with customer success to ensure that we met those expectations. Was there misalignment? Okay, what does that look like? So there's all these feedback loops embedded in the business, and you want to be very thoughtful about managing those as well. We touch on those. Meetings are structured and kind of output driven. So it's not so much, hey, how's this thing going? It's much more of, this meeting has this agenda. It leads to these action items. This is who's accountable for executing these action items. This is how you execute those action items, refer to these playbooks, et cetera. And you start to feel like, whoa, like we're in the matrix and this thing purrs. And that's what we're after. And then other kind of tenets, and we index really hard towards like raw transparency. So you want the whole, and it's all, Elon has a term for it, but it's like basically vector is kind of magnitude and direction. So put in the context of a business, if everybody's rowing as hard as they can in the same direction, that's a higher vector. Like the business is going to punch through at a much faster rate than if you have everybody, or 80% of folks are rowing in the right direction, the other 20% are rowing in the opposite direction, right? That's kind of a catastrophic outcome. So the first thing you want, or something that is kind of a tenet of this whole thing, is very clear goals and objectives, and making those real-time accessible and highly visible, and then beating the drum to kind of reinforce that stuff over time. And then lastly, cross-functional collab obviously becomes much tighter and all that other stuff. So like what we're after is like turning knowledge, procedure, how to do stuff, why we do stuff, the nuances, the pitfalls, the knowledge about the industry, the domain, the buyer personas, all that stuff. We want to turn that knowledge into operating leverage. That's kind of the headline here. So enough of the preamble. Let's jump in. So some principles. And again, like the actual execution here, highly recommend Notion. Like it is just makes this stuff really a breeze, and you can kind of build it as you need it and build it and kind of iterate over time. But here are some principles for this concept of knowledge management. And we'll just use that as the tagline. First is that it's a single source of truth. So there's one definitive workspace for all major functions. It contains operating models, why we do this and what we do on a functional basis, playbooks, how we do stuff in the context for it. And then SOPs are, straightforward step-by-step elements. And I guess power law is roaring its head here big time. So you want to apply like, what's the 20% of stuff across everything we're talking about here that yields the 80% impact? And you want this to be as least noisy and simple as humanly possible. So single source of truth, then on to clear structure and navigation. So each function has a dedicated operating model page. And then embedded within that, you've got your playbooks. And then embedded in the playbooks, you've got some SOPs. And this sounds complicated, but it fits pretty neatly together once you start to roll. And then, of course, it's got reference materials. So think ICP information, frameworks, feedback loops, cross-functional workflows, all the stuff we've kind of spoken about. And you can just link that together easy enough. So it starts, and this is where you start to think, okay, architecture, and that's what we'll talk about next. Another core tenet is that there is ownership and ongoing updates. So this is a dynamic, living, breathing thing, just like the business. So each document, like each key document, and by key document, I would suggest that's an operating model, a playbook, or an SOP, has an owner who keeps it current. And then, of course, feedback. Everyone can provide feedback. Like we want to iterate our way to the promised land, as we say. And then I would suggest kind of revisiting this wholesale, once a year, and just making sure that there's not some stuff that's super dated. So some best practices for you: SOP versus playbook. This is it's like, is that a play? And you just remove even that's cognitive load. Like, what should this be? And so it's like, here's clear direction. SOP, one very repeatable process or workflow, step by step. There's a very defined outcome. Playbooks are kind of multi-phase motions that have way more context. And it's like, we're trying to get to this outcome, but there's some ways to get there. And there's some variations of the outcome that we're trying to get to. So like sales process is a playbook. SOP is like converting a deal to closed won in the CRM. That's a very useful example. Sorry, I should have led with that. On to another best practice: link, don't duplicate. So again, this kind of backs into a single source of truth. You don't want redundant documents everywhere. It just becomes a mess. And then for the business and the team, it's like a search first, act second. And if you do have a more mature business and you're rolling this out in terms of behavior change and adoption, ideally it's like, hey, where do I find this? Search in the thing. Hey, where do I find this? Search in the thing. Where do I find this? Search in the thing. But that is different than like, go into Google Drive and Godspeed. It's like, go into the thing for your function. It's in the playbook. And then eventually you should start seeing those questions decline because everyone's going to it's faster. Just go to the source, get the information they need and on. And then lastly, keep it evergreen. So in terms of architecture, as we had spoken about, so there's some other elements as I noted on. Operating models are like the base, and I would just start with sales, customer success, product, and then like admin, finance. And that's the stuff you really want to strip as much thinking out of as humanly possible. So you've got in that operating model, you've got objectives for the function, metrics for the function, and roles. Those are kind of the key elements. And then that'll obviously include, links to the playbooks. In the playbooks, this is very much a multi-step guide on what to do and why it matters. So in the sales context, outbound prospecting, new customer onboarding, those are all par for the course with playbooks. And then there'll be little SOPs that are, again, very action oriented that are embedded in there. Beyond that, we've got meeting tables. So this is another one where it's like every meeting has an owner, every meeting has an agenda, and action items are documented and crystal clear to ensure accountability. So you want to centralize your meetings as much as humanly possible and make sure that those agendas are consistent and that you're iterating on the agendas and making those meetings as efficient as humanly possible. And I guess the first question is, can we delete this meeting straight up? Can this be async? Like, do we need to have live collaboration, et cetera? Then we move into scorecards, which is performance tracking. And so you want to have, and this is kind of another cascading thing. So one way to think about it is every function has a scorecard that's like, these are the 5 metrics that we utilize to ensure, high performance across this function. And then those things should tree up into a firm-wide version, which is like, these are the 10 metrics across the whole business that we need to look at on a weekly basis to feel good that we're moving in the right direction. If you're just getting started, start at the firm level. And so those will cut across kind of the core functions. And it's like, what's the number one thing we need to measure? And when it comes to those scorecards, there's a lot to balance there as well. Because in the context we use them on a weekly basis, we adhere mostly to the Entrepreneur Operating System, EOS. So there's kind of this conversation around what do we need to look at on a weekly basis and cutting across kind of those core functions and then dovetailing into the businesses I just mentioned. And you want to be thoughtful, like, okay, we have kind of long-term goals, like fundamental metrics that we want to look at. How do we reconcile that with this quarter's OKRs, with kind of our annual goals? So there's some blending of long-term goals into the here and now, meaning the quarterly objectives. And then there's a thought process around leading versus lagging indicators and kind of throughput or conversion or efficiency metrics. So that was a lot of buzzwords in the example. Maybe I'll share an example of scorecards in the future because that's a really, 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 really productive. You can't improve what you don't measure, et cetera. There's a lot of OG management tenets in there. And then lastly is reference material. So this is function specific, team oriented, market oriented. That's like context. And you want to document as much of that stuff as you can and then just, socialize it across the whole business, make sure that everybody's in line. So this is an example high level structure and it's got 10 parts and ours, we're less in kind of like the conventional micro SaaS. We're like in the micro cap kind of category. But starting, you have strategic foundations. So this is vision, goals, strategic initiatives, org charts, or accountability charts, as it's referred to in EOS, which is another really critical component. Playbooks and SOPs, key meetings, scorecards, and foundational frameworks. So if you're going to do anything, it's probably the strategic foundations. And then you move into market context and industry insights. So this is addressable market, buyer mechanics, persona profiles, industry trends, all that good stuff. Then you start to get into the dirty. Operations and processes. So this is where you want to centralize, like, these are the tools we use. This is a definition of data and how we think about that. These are the cross-functional dependencies or the feedback loops in the business. That's where that stuff centralizes. Then you get into functional-based stuff. And so in a sales-led growth context, or I guess in any context, but our context is mostly sales-led growth now, is customer acquisition. So this is going to focus on acquisition strategies, operating models, team coordination, et cetera. Then into customer success, post-sale engagement, operating models, customer success activities, customer advisory boards, knowledge sharing, external wikis, stuff like that. Into marketing, into product and technology, people. So this is kind of recruiting scorecards, roles that you're recruiting for, and then into like the quick and dirty of employee benefits. Again, centralizing the knowledge that your team needs to have access to in real time. Finance, legal, and admin. This is where you put all the kind of necessary evils, if you will. So models, forecasts, template terms. This is very important. Centralizing all those kind of templated legal documents that you're using or kind of transacting with on a regular basis. And then again, the intent here is that 9 out of 10 of these sections are real-time, visible, and transparent as hell across the entire business. But the last section is sensitive and private. So this is like, well, you hate to have everybody staring at each other's social security numbers and doing stuff like that. So you need a section for confidential, kind of exec eyes only stuff. So let's jump into, or let's wrap with some real world examples. So an AE is executing outbound. And I'll just give you one, or I'll give you two. And so the new account executive, he needs to launch an outbound campaign. We're going after prospects of the, I guess are of a certain ACV, et cetera. And traditionally it would be like, oh boy, he's going to talk to RevOps to figure out what the hell we use for outbound. He's going to talk to marketing to see if, what templates we have. So in the context of kind of having this knowledge management system rolling, he's going to head over to sales and marketing. He's going to head to the sales operating model, and he's going to go to outbound and prospecting. And there's going to be the outbound playbook. He's going to have kind of step-by-step procedure. If he gets lost, he steps into the SOP, and away we go. And what is like the outcome or the result here? The AE is operational within hours, not weeks. And it ensures that when he gets active and he's operational and he's productive, that he's adhering to the standards and to the guidance that you've kind of iterated on over and over and over. So it's just, simply put, it's speed to the desired outcome. Like that's really what it's about. Another example, sales to customer success handoff. So a deal is about to close and sales needs to transition in, customer success. And you got to be so thoughtful about these handoffs. Like these are make or break a business in many contexts. But in this case, okay, go to the sales operating model or the CS operating model, and it's very distinct that there is like a cross-functional dependency or that there's a feedback loop there. Find the new customer activation playbook, the sales, handoff SOP. There's going to be all that kind of stuff. And in that situation, an SOP might clarify, all right, what data needs to be in the CRM, or what is that kind of handoff document where you're getting the customer success team up to speed and providing as much context as humanly possible. Scheduling the 30, 60, 90-day check-ins with CS. So it's like, hey, we just brought on a new customer. Let's check in 30 days and tune that. Let's check in 60 days, 90 days to make sure that we're aligned across the board. And so what's the outcome? Smooth onboarding, smooth handoffs, no starting over when they get to customer success. That's obviously a catastrophic outcome. And then kind of structured, already calendarized feedback loops between sales and customer success as they go. And then all of this is subject to how you skin the cat and how you think about all that. But here are just some examples. I think that's a wrap, y'all. So hopefully this is super useful. We spent a lot of time sharpening this and backing up. Before we treated Notion as kind of a catch-all, like, all right, this is all the marketing stuff. Okay, this is all the other stuff. And when you start to think about it from an architecture perspective, just like a product, you get a lot of clarity. And so this definitely felt like a whoa, like a high five from the SaaS gods when we got through this. And I hope you find it useful as well. For the love of the game, till next time, cheers.